I was recently sharing a drink with an old colleague who spends his life navigating the high-stakes world of global energy consulting. He was scrolling through a news alert about a fresh diplomatic overture toward a regime that only a year ago he described to me as an irredeemable stain on the map. He didn't look frustrated, though. He looked satisfied. He tapped the screen and muttered, "Finally, we're being grown-ups. They have the minerals we need, and more importantly, they keep their borders tight. The streets are quiet." It was a jarring pivot. This was the same person who just months prior had been lecturing me on the moral necessity of sanctions and the non-negotiable nature of human rights. But standing there in that dimly lit lounge, the passion for universal values had evaporated, replaced by a cold, clinical appreciation for what he called the stability premium. To him, the regime hadn't changed. Their prisons were just as full, but their utility had. They had transitioned from a tyranny to a strategic partner simply by holding the right cards at the right time. That instantaneous shift, where a villain becomes a necessity the moment a supply chain is threatened, perfectly captures the strange bifurcated reality of modern geopolitics. It's a world where morality isn't a fixed compass, but a diplomatic payload, a weapon to be unholstered against competitors and tucked away when dealing with friends. We call it the rules-based order, but in practice, it often looks more like a marketplace where sovereignty and human rights are traded like commodities. It leaves you wondering, are these values actually the foundation of our global system, or are they just a suitcase we pack and unpack, depending on the destination? Is there such a thing as a good dictator, or have we just reached a point where right and wrong are entirely defined by who you're standing against? To understand why the world looks so hypocritical right now, we have to look past the rhetoric and into the cold logic of strategic utility.
That is a chilling anecdote to start with, but it really does cut through all the noise, doesn't it? It gets straight to the heart of the matter.
It really does.
What your colleague was doing in that bar, maybe it was the dim lighting and the drink. He was just saying the quiet part out loud.
Exactly. The part that's usually saved for classified memos.
Right. And it's because we are in the middle of this massive structural shift in how the world actually functions. For the last 30 years, really since the Berlin Wall came down, we've all been operating under this big assumption.
The end of history idea?
Precisely. The idea that liberal universal values, democracy, free speech, human rights, that they were the inevitable endpoint. The idea was that eventually everyone would look more or less like us, like the West. But that era, I think it's safe to say it's effectively over. The tide has gone out, and now we're seeing what was really underneath the whole time.
And that is exactly the mission for this deep dive.
Right.
We aren't here today to moralize. We're not going to tell you who the good guys are or the bad guys are.
Because it's not that simple anymore.
It's not. We want to peel back those layers and try to understand the world through the eyes of the people who are actually reshaping it. We need to step into the shoes of the people who are prioritizing, stability and cultural identity and raw industrial output over what we in the West think of as procedural values. Because if we don't understand their logic, we don't understand the world we're living in.
Exactly. We are witnessing the erosion of those universalist ideals, and they're being replaced by three very hard, very tangible realities. These are the forces that are actually driving decision-making in capitals from Beijing to Ankara to, all across the global south.
Okay, so let's break them down. What are the three?
First, you have state capacity. Can the government actually deliver the goods? Can it build a road? Can it keep the lights on?
Simple, basic functionality.
Yes. Second, civilizational identity. The question of who are we fundamentally as a people? And crucially, why does that make us different from the West? And third, and maybe the most brutal of them all, is resource realpolitik. Simply put, do you have the stuff, the minerals, the resources we need to survive the next century?
Okay, so let's dig into that first pillar, state capacity. Because I think for a lot of us living in the West, we have a very specific, almost academic definition of what good governance is.
We do. We have a checklist.
Right, a checklist. Is the election fair? Can the press criticize the leader? Is the judiciary independent? But for a huge chunk of the world, isn't that definition much, much simpler?
It's much simpler, and it's much more visceral, honestly. Yeah. For billions of people, good governance isn't about the ballot box, it's about the light switch.
Does the light come on when I flip it?
Exactly. It's about the faucet. Does clean water come out, or is it brown sludge? If you're sitting in a comfortable suburb in a developed nation, you have the incredible luxury of worrying about procedural justice. You can afford to worry about whether the town council meeting was transparent, or if the zoning laws were followed to the letter.
Those are, in a way, second-order problems.
They are, because if you're in a developing nation, the hierarchy of needs is completely different. It is about survival. It's about basic functionality. Can the state provide the absolute basics of a modern life?
This reminds me of a story I came across in the research for this about a man named Alisher. He's a logistics manager, and he lives in this rapidly developing hub in Central Asia. His story just perfectly highlights this disconnect between our ideals in the West and the reality on the ground.
Oh, this is a fantastic example.
For years, Alisher sat through these seminars. You know the type. Funded by Western NGOs, held in a hotel conference room with bottled water and flip charts. And they'd talk at length about judicial reform, the abstract beauty of a free press, the importance of multi-party elections.
All the software updates.
Exactly, all the software updates. But every single evening, Alisher would leave that seminar and he'd go home to a house where the electricity flickered on and off all night, destroying his appliances. He'd have to drive home on roads that were basically treacherous pits of mud, just ruining his truck.
So there's this huge gap between the lecture and his actual life. The West was offering him these ideals, these software packages about democracy and rights, while the actual hardware of his country was completely broken.
Completely broken. And then I saw a video of him recently, and he was standing on the platform of a gleaming new high-speed rail terminal. This wasn't built with a Western aid package. There were no conditions attached. It was built by a neighboring regional power. The report didn't specify, but we can guess it was probably China.
Almost certainly.
And there were no seminars attached to this construction project. No lectures on democratic procedure, just a brutal, efficient focus on state capacity and engineering, and you could just see it in his face. For Alisher, the human right to move his goods to market and heat his home had finally and totally superseded the human right to a ballot box that never seemed to fix the power grid.
And that right there is such a crucial pivot point. It challenges the entire Western theory of development that's dominated for the last 50 years.
It really struck me. I mean, try to imagine his perspective, right? When a bridge is built without a lecture, the bridge itself becomes the most persuasive political argument. As a journalist covering these shifts, I can't help but feel that we in the West just consistently underestimate how freedom feels to someone who has never had a reliable road.
That's a great way to put it.
While we're over here worrying about the erosion of liberal norms, Alisher is witnessing the birth of a functional state. And to him, that is the only progress that matters.
The bridge itself becomes the most persuasive political argument. I love that phrasing because it just perfectly captures the tangible nature of this shift. Alisher represents this massive demographic, what we might call the global South or the developing world, that the West just fundamentally misunderstands so often.
How so?
We look at that high-speed rail terminal and we immediately ask a certain set of questions. Was there a transparent bidding process? Were labor rights respected? Was there an environmental impact study? Is this a debt trap? All valid questions from our perspective.
Right, the procedural question.
The procedural questions. But Alisher looks at that same terminal and he says, I can finally get to work on time. My children can get to school without walking through mud. My vegetables won't rot in the truck before they reach the city market. It's a completely different set of priorities.
It feels like a slap in the face to Western diplomacy, doesn't it? We come in with binders full of regulations and moral benchmarks, and meanwhile, someone else just comes in with concrete and steel and gets the job done.
Well, let's connect this to the bigger historical picture, because there's a bit of amnesia in the Western narrative here. We really need to talk about the high horse problem.
The high horse problem.
Yeah. The West often preaches the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which, remember, was signed in 1948 as a baseline requirement for development. We say, you must have these rights before you can be a legitimate partner, before we invest. But historically, that is absolutely not how the West developed.
You mean we didn't exactly follow our own rule book when we were building our economies in the 19th and early 20th centuries?
Far from it. I mean, not even close.
Sure.
If you look at the Industrial Revolution in Britain or the westward expansion of the United States or the entire colonial era in Europe, these were periods of immense economic growth, no doubt, but what were they built on?
Exploitation.
Exactly. They were built on the back of labor exploitation, slavery, child labor in factories, the suspension of rights for vast swaths of the population. We didn't fully democratize until after we got rich. The argument now coming from the developing world is basically, You compromised on human rights for centuries to achieve your prosperity. You polluted your skies and exploited your workers to build your capital base. Why are you now pulling up the ladder and telling us we can't prioritize growth over abstract liberties?
That's a powerful pushback.
Yeah.
It's essentially them saying, let us get rich first. Then we can talk about the niceties and the luxuries of liberal democracy.
That is the absolute core of the stability premium concept, this idea that order has to come before liberty. And here is the cynical kicker. Western powers quietly agree with this more often than they're willing to admit.
How do you mean?
Look at the geopolitical map. The US and the EU will publicly criticize human rights abuses, they'll issue press releases, maybe they'll issue a visa ban on some minor official to make a point. But behind closed doors, there is a very distinct, unspoken preference for regimes that can maintain order. If a strong man keeps the borders tight, keeps terrorism contained, and keeps the oil or the minerals flowing, they get a pass.
And we see this play out with things like international justice, don't we? I mean, who actually gets sanctioned? Who gets prosecuted by the International Criminal Court?
It's almost always the smaller nations, the ones without a veto power on the UN Security Council, or nations that don't have a powerful patron protecting them. It just feeds this narrative that universal human rights are actually just a tool for the powerful to discipline the weak.
It creates this perception of a double standard, where international law looks a lot more like a weapon for the powerful rather than a truly universal standard that applies to everyone.
And this brings us right to the competing economic models. For decades, the only game in town was the Washington Consensus.
Right, the classic neoliberal playbook. This was the absolute mantra of the 90s. Privatize everything, open your markets to foreign capital, cut government spending, austerity measures, basically shock therapy for your economy.
Yes. And while you could argue it stabilized inflation in some places like, say, Chile or Peru, it often just decimated local industries and led to massive, massive inequality. To the average person, it just felt like chaos. It stripped away social safety nets, all in the name of efficiency. It was a model that said, the market knows best, just get the state out of the way.
And now you contrast that with what Alisher is seeing on the ground, the Beijing Consensus.
Which is the model that built that train station he's so proud of, and it's fundamentally different.
How so? What's the core difference?
The Beijing model prioritizes state-led development. It's gradualist. It says, don't blow up your entire economy with shock therapy. That's insane. Instead, it says, keep the government in control of key strategic sectors, energy, finance, telecommunications, and focus on infrastructure first.
Get the hardware right before you worry about the software.
Precisely. And it really appeals to the Alishers of the world because it emphasizes self-determination. It basically says to them, you don't have to listen to the IMS lectures anymore. You can evolve at your own pace in your own way.
It seems so much more results-oriented. The Washington Consensus worries about abstract numbers, right? GDP growth, stock market liquidity, things that often just benefit the elite who already own assets. The Beijing model, at least in its sales pitch, talks about poverty alleviation, roads, bridges, and ports, physical metrics of welfare.
And that is incredibly seductive. It prioritizes evolution over revolution. For a developing nation that is absolutely terrified of instability, of civil war, of chaos, the Beijing model offers a roadmap that doesn't involve political upheaval. It makes the argument that the right to a functioning economy is the prerequisite for all other rights. It argues that you can't have human rights if you're starving or if warlords are running the streets.
Okay, so if the first pillar is this state capacity argument, the idea that a working road is better than a broken vote, then the second pillar we identified is even more psychological, I think. It's about identity.
Yes.
Because it's not just about economics, is it? It's about how these nations feel about themselves in a world that's been dominated by Western culture for so long.
This is where we move from the physical infrastructure, the roads and bridges, to the mental infrastructure of a nation. We're seeing the rise of what's being called the civilizational state. And this is a fascinating and, to be honest, a somewhat dangerous evolution in political thought.
To get at this, I want to bring in another perspective. I was reading an essay by a woman named Elena, a cultural historian in a major Eastern capital, and she described the civilizational state not as some abstract political theory, but as a survival kit.
A survival kit, that's a powerful way to put it.
She spoke of the 1990s as a period of profound humiliation.
And humiliation is such a potent political force. It drives history much more than we like to admit.
She described it so vividly. She said universalist values, Western movies, Western NGOs, Western fashion, Western curriculum. It all felt like a soft power invasion. An invasion intended to just dissolve her nation's unique history into this gray, globalized soup.
A kind of cultural flattening.
Exactly. She told the story of a local library that was being pressured by an international funder to replace its traditional archives with a globalized curriculum to meet some standard. They were literally being told to throw out their own local stories to make room for what the West considered standard knowledge. Now she supports a government that asserts its own cultural rules-based order.
So she sees the state as a protector.
Yes. To Elena, the state isn't just an administrator, it's a fortress protecting a sacred garden of tradition from the universalist storm raging outside. I saw her explain in an interview that sovereignty isn't just about borders on a map, it's about the right to remain different from the West. And I'll be honest, as someone who values universal liberties, hearing her prioritize cultural survival over individual rights is jarring. It's difficult to hear.
It is. It goes against everything we're taught to value.
But we have to recognize the emotional weight of this narrative. For people like Elena, the civilizational state provides a sense of dignity and continuity that a volatile Western-style democracy failed to deliver in the 90s. It's a defensive crouch that an entire segment of the world is now adopting to protect who they are.
A defensive crouch. That is a very, very powerful image. And Elena's perspective helps us understand why this concept of the civilizational state has gained so much traction in places like Russia, China, Turkey, and India. It challenges the fundamental assumption of the last century, that the nation-state is the final, ultimate form of political organization.
We usually think of countries as nation-states, right? You have borders, a government, a flag, a seat at the UN. That's the standard unit of international relations. But a civilizational state is claiming to be something bigger than that, isn't it?
No, much bigger. It claims to be a distinct cultural universe unto itself. The core argument here is that things like human rights and democracy are not universal at all.
So they're rejecting the whole premise.
They're rejecting the premise entirely. They argue that these are culturally specific Western constructs. They're ideas that grew out of the European Enlightenment, specific to the history of Europe and North America. So when the West comes in and critiques their human rights record, they don't hear a moral argument. They hear a cultural attack. They hear an imperialist attempt to impose alien values on a civilization that might be thousands of years older than the United States.
It's brilliant if, cynical defensive strategy. If you say you're oppressing your people, they can just turn around and say, no, we are protecting our civilization from your cultural virus.
Yeah.
It just shuts down the conversation immediately.
It does more than that. It turns the criticism into a badge of honor. Look at Russia. You have these key ideologues, figures like Vladislav Surkov, who for a long time was a top advisor to Putin. He described Russia not as just another European country, but as a half-breed.
A half-breed. That's a strange and evocative term for a political doctrine.
He meant it as a unique state civilization that blends East and West, but belongs to neither. He called it a Western-Eastern half-breed nation. Charismatic, talented, beautiful, and lonely. By framing Russia this way, they're arguing that Western yardsticks simply don't apply. You can't measure Russia by European standards because Russia isn't Europe. It's its own solar system. It implies that Russia has its own gravity, its own physics, and therefore its own moral code.
And we see this exact same logic in China, when Xi Jinping constantly referencing China's 5,000 years of continuous history.
Exactly. The narrative there is that the Communist Party isn't just a political administration that happened to take power in 1949. No, they are the modern custodians of a 5,000-year-old legacy. So if you attack the party, you're not just attacking a government, you're attacking Chinese civilization itself.
It's the same move Erdogan has made in Turkey.
It's the same playbook. Shifting from the secular nationalism of Ataturk to this kind of neo-Ottoman idea, positioning Turkey as the natural leader of the Islamic Ummah. They are all rejecting the idea that they are just countries that need to catch up to the West. They're saying, we are civilizations and we are your equals.
This effectively redraws the map, doesn't it? I mean, it's not just about where your borders are on Google Maps anymore. It's about where your civilizational space begins and ends.
And that is the really dangerous part. This framing legitimizes extraterritorial claims. If you see yourself as a civilizational state, your responsibility isn't just to the citizens within your borders, but to your people, your civilization, wherever they may be.
So that's the justification.
That's the justification. Russia claims Ukraine is part of its civilizational space, the so-called Russian world. China claims Taiwan based on historical continuity. It provides a moral framework for expansionism. It blurs the lines of sovereignty because the state's reach is seen to extend as far as its culture does.
And it's not just happening over there, right? I mean, we are starting to see this kind of language creep into the West, too.
Absolutely. We are not immune to this at all. You hear leaders like Macron in France talking about defending European civilization. You hear right-wing populists in the US and Europe framing migration not as a policy challenge, but as a civilizational threat. They talk about the West not as a political alliance, but as an identity that needs to be defended from outsiders.
So it's a global trend towards a kind of tribalism.
It is.
Yeah.
And it makes a shared global moral language almost impossible because we aren't even agreeing on the basic definitions of right and wrong anymore. We're just defending our culture.
So we have the argument for state capacity, I need roads, not lectures. We have the argument for civilizational identity, I need to be me, not you. But then there's the third and perhaps the coldest and most pragmatic reality of them all.
The sheer undeniable weight of the supply chain.
Right. This is where the rubber meets the road.
Or maybe where the lithium meets the battery. We can talk about values and culture all day long, but modern society runs on physical stuff. And the global competition for that stuff is forcing a return to pure, unfiltered realpolitik.
For this, I came across a series of leaked messages from a provincial official in a mineral-rich region of Africa. Let's call him the gatekeeper. He is tasked with managing one of the world's largest cobalt deposits, and he described what he called the Realpolitik dance that he performs every single week.
The Realpolitik dance. I like that.
On Mondays, he meets with European delegates, and they come in and they demand transparency reports, labor audits. They often withhold infrastructure aid until certain procedural benchmarks are met. They bring clipboards, they check boxes, and they lecture him on corruption. On Tuesdays, he meets with industrial contractors from the East, likely China or Russia. They arrive with crates of equipment ready to dig, offering a direct swap, our minerals for your modernized electrical grid.
And which one does he choose?
He chose the latter. I saw a photo of the new hospital that was built right next to the mine. No votes were cast for its construction, no transparency reports were filed, but its beds are full and they are functioning. This is the new global competition, where industrial output is the only currency that really carries weight.
It's just so stark.
It is. And looking at this from a geopolitical lens, it's just crystal clear that the era of values-based diplomacy is hitting a hard wall of results-based reality. We might find it cynical that critical mineral supply chains are being secured at the cost of democratic oversight. But in the global race for the green transition, the world is proving that it prefers a reliable supplier over a righteous one. It's a return to a cold transactional world where the person who delivers the physical results wins the alliance.
That provincial official is living at the absolute epicenter of the New World Order. The Realpolitik dance he describes is happening everywhere, in dozens of countries. And frankly, the West is finally starting to realize that its Monday meeting approach, the lectures, the benchmarks, the conditionality, is consistently losing to the Tuesday meeting approach of direct trade and infrastructure.
And nowhere is this clearer than what's happening in Angola right now. There's this fascinating case study of the libido corridor. This feels like the perfect example of this flip-flopping morality we talked about in the intro.
This is a perfect example of what we're calling the pivot. To understand how truly crazy this is, you have to look at the history. During the Cold War, the U.S. supported a rebel group in Angola called UNITA.
Against the government.
Against the ruling party, the MPLA, because the MPLA was allied with Russia and Cuba. It was a classic Cold War proxy fight. In Washington's eyes, the MPLA were the bad guys. They were Marxist, they were anti-democratic, they were the enemy.
But now, that entire script has been flipped on its head.
Completely. Today, the Biden administration is going all in on supporting the MPLA and their president, João Lourenço. Now, is President Lourenço a great beacon of democracy? Hardly. The opposition, which is still UNITA, contested the last election, claiming widespread fraud. There are credible reports of repression, human rights violations, the whole 9 yards. The prisons are still full of the same kinds of people. But the U.S. is rolling out the red carpet for him. Why?
It has to be because of what's in the ground.
It's because of the libido corridor. This is a massive railway project that links the mineral-rich regions of the Democratic Republic of Congo and Zambia to the Atlantic port in Angola. We were talking about copper, cobalt, lithium, the absolute lifeblood of the electric vehicle revolution and the entire green transition. The U.S. is now backing a $2 billion investment there.
So we've essentially made the calculation that securing those minerals away from Chinese control is more important than the democratic complaints of the Angolan opposition.
That is the cold, hard logic. It is a transaction. We give you recognition and legitimacy for your regime, and in exchange, you give us geostrategic alignment against China and access to those critical minerals. The irony is just palpable. The U.S. is now backing the very party it once spent decades trying to overthrow, simply because the utility of that party has changed.
And you see major corporate players like Trafigura involved, despite their spotty history with transparency.
It's business first. The values are the suitcase, and for Angola, that suitcase is currently staying closed and locked.
It seems like the West is waking up to what you could call a physical barrier. For a long time, we thought we could just design things, own the intellectual property, and let other people build them. We traded our factories for finance and services. But now there's this slow, dawning realization that, wait, we actually need the factories. We need to be able to make things.
That is the industrial learning curve, which is often formalized as something called rights law.
Okay, break down rights law for us.
Yeah.
What does that actually mean in practice?
It's a concept from engineering economics, and it was originally observed in aircraft manufacturing back in the 1930s. It basically says that for every cumulative doubling of production, your costs go down by a constant percentage.
So the more you make, the better and cheaper you get at making it.
Exactly. It's learning by doing on a massive industrial scale. China didn't just build factories. They committed to the learning curve. For decades, they poured state capital, patient capital into things like solar, wind, and batteries. They made mistakes, they optimized the supply chains, they worked out the kinks, and they drove the costs down, down, down.
But numbers are just staggering. I was looking at the data on solar manufacturing. China controls something like 80% of global solar production.
Yeah.
But for the core components, the wafers and polysilicon, it's more like 95%.
It is total dominance, and that creates what you call the physical barrier. You can pass all the tariffs you want in Washington, you can write all the ambitious policy papers you want in Brussels about a green transition, but if your solar panels cost 50 or 65% more to make than the Chinese ones because you haven't built the industrial base, you lose. You cannot legislate away a manufacturing deficit.
It reminds me of another story I read about a logistics manager in Rotterdam named Marcus. He's standing there on the docks just watching these enormous container ships come in from the east, stacked high with batteries and inverters and solar panels. And he realizes that all the carbon taxes and moral posturing in Europe can't compete with the sheer physical reality of that supply chain.
You can't regulate your way out of a manufacturing deficit. That's the crux of the dilemma for the West. To save the planet, to actually achieve the green transition, we must buy the tools from our primary civilizational state rival. It makes moral embargoes impractical when the fate of the climate hinges on the industrial output of the very country you're trying to contain. We've moved from a world of resource scarcity, who has the oil, to a world of manufacturing abundance, who has the factories. And right now, the factories are in the East.
So where does this leave us? I mean, we've got Alisher choosing the bridge over the ballot. We have Elena choosing her civilization over universal rights. And we have the provincial official choosing the contractor who brings the excavator over the one who brings the audit.
It leads us to a pretty bleak phenomenon called campism, and what I would call the tribalization of empathy.
Unpack that for me.
Yeah.
Tribalization of empathy. That sounds incredibly dark.
It is. It means that our ability to care about victims, about human suffering, has become conditional. We only acknowledge suffering if it fits our preferred geopolitical narrative. We're retreating into our tribes, our camps.
Can you give us an example of how that plays out on, say, both sides of the political spectrum?
Sure. If you identify with the anti-imperialist left, for example, you might ignore or explain away repression in Venezuela or Iran because those regimes are seen as opposing the U.S. You say, well, they're fighting the empire, so they get a pass on how they treat their own people. You ignore the torture chambers because the victims are inconvenient to your worldview.
And conversely, if you're on the neoconservative right, you might ignore repression in a strategic partner, like, say, Saudi Arabia or Egypt, because they are seen as a bulwark against communism or Islamism.
Exactly. The victim is no longer a human being who requires protection. They become evidence. They become a political tool. And we pack and unpack our human rights suitcase depending entirely on the destination. If the destination is a rival, we unpack the suitcase and we scream about their rights abuses from the rooftops. If the destination is a partner, the suitcase stays firmly closed.
It's the benevolent dictator fallacy all over again. We label a dictator good or bad based purely on whether their instability spills over their borders or disrupts our trade.
Right. We have effectively stripped the morality out of the system and replaced it with a simple stability metric. Is this person useful to us or not?
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? We started this deep dive asking if universal values are the real foundation of our global system, or if they're just a diplomatic weapon.
And I think the conclusion we have to draw is that this selectivity, this hypocrisy, is actually a rational adaptation to a world without a global enforcer. There is no world police that actually applies the law equally to everyone. So nations are doing what they have always done. They're trying to survive. They are trading sovereignty and rights in a global marketplace. And in this new marketplace, the stability premium, the ability to keep the lights on and the streets quiet, and industrial sovereignty, the ability to make your own stuff, are the only currencies that really, truly matter.
It's a sobering reality check. We like to think we live in a world governed by laws and ideals, but we might just be living in a world governed by logistics. And here's a final thought to chew on as you go about your day. We often ask, what is the cost of doing business with a dictator? But in this new world of supply chain vulnerability and civilizational fortresses, the question the world seems to be asking instead is, can we afford the price of morality when the lights go out?
That is the question of our time.